Welcome. Today we're here to talk about Colorado's hazardous waste disposal regulations and how they apply to healthcare facilities in Colorado. We'll get into background information, a brief description of how these regulations work, and an explanation of how these regulations are implemented at healthcare facilities. But first, let me introduce Dan Getz. He's an environmental protection specialist with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Dan, where's the first place you would send people if they're confused or overwhelmed by Colorado's hazardous waste regulations?
You know, a great start would be this video. We're going to get into what the regulations are. We're going to talk about how they apply to healthcare facilities. We're going to talk about strategies on how to be compliant with this information and how to stay in compliance as time goes on. So this video is definitely a great start. To back this up, I would suggest also our frequently asked questions document. We have a website with a lot of supporting documentation, and on there is the FAQs. And the FAQs are questions that people have been asking in the healthcare industry about these regulations for the last couple of years. I assemble all of that into one document for people to use as we go forward. So it's a great place to go. If you're thinking a question, it's a good chance it's going to be on that FAQ. So definitely want to check that out in conjunction with this video. Another way to get some help right away would be to call our technical assistance hotline. We have a good technical assistance scenario, and for us it's a compliance assistance scenario, which means when a person calls in and asks their question, it can be anonymous. They don't have to give their address, they don't have to give their name, their facility name. They don't have to worry about us coming out to do an inspection. They don't have to worry about any kind of consequences just because they called and asked a question about compliance. So using our technical assistance hotline is a great way to go. And if you need additional information, they'll forward you to the right person. So a lot of times when questions come in about pharmaceutical waste, for instance, that question will get forwarded over to me, and then I'll be able to follow up with the individual that called in. So those three strategies are a great way to get started to understand these regulations, apply them in your facility, and get additional help as needed.
Great. So how many different waste streams exist in the healthcare setting?
There's 5 main categories, and we're going to be touching on all 5 today. And then we're really going to narrow it down. But the 5 main categories are your sharps waste, your biohazardous waste, surgical waste, depending on the type of healthcare facility, laboratory waste, again, depending on the type of healthcare facility, and pharmaceutical waste. Okay,
great. It sounds like a healthcare facility can generate a lot of different waste types. You were just mentioning, those 5. Can you speak to which regulations typically apply to each waste stream?
Sure. All waste in Colorado's regulations start as a solid waste. And the term solid waste you don't want to get hung up on too much, because the term solid, as defined in the solid waste regulations, can be a solid, a liquid, or a gaseous waste. But it's generally called solid waste. And so it all starts off as a solid waste. So your sharps waste and your biohazardous waste, there are very specific categories in the solid waste regulations. So solid waste, you start off with the typical waste material. If you throw out a pen, you throw out an empty plastic container, that just falls under solid waste regulations. But depending on the type of waste, it might meet additional definition in the regulations and then be regulated a little bit more specifically, like sharps waste and like biohazardous waste. But then you get into some more specialized waste, like laboratory waste. And lab waste could be a solid waste or another category called Colorado hazardous waste. And that's a set of regulations. It's a state set of regulations, Colorado hazardous waste regulations. And some of this waste can meet those definitions in the Colorado hazardous waste, some won't. So understanding those nuances, those differences, help folks to understand which regulations apply, where to go for information, and then how to manage and dispose of that waste. Pharmaceuticals can be a solid waste, or it can also be classified as a Colorado hazardous waste. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, how these regulations, which regulations apply, how they apply, and how to know the difference.
Excellent. I'm new to some of these terms, as I'm sure a lot of our facilities. What exactly are Colorado's hazardous waste regulations, and how does that relate to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, commonly referred to as RCRA?
Yeah, the acronym RCRA is very common in the industry. And so it's important to understand that when you hear the term RCRA waste or RCRA regulations, RCRA disposal, again, that's very common in industry. However, in Colorado, it's important to understand that RCRA is the federal statute that gives EPA the authority to promulgate the federal hazardous waste regulations, as well as allow EPA to authorize states with their own hazardous waste statute and regulations to operate in lieu of the federal RCRA program. So Colorado is what you call an authorized state. And so what that means is that the EPA has authorized Colorado's hazardous waste laws to operate in lieu of the federal RCRA program. So during this training, I'm going to be referring to Colorado hazardous waste, or just say hazardous waste, which is also commonly known as RCRA waste in industry. When I use the term hazardous waste in this training, I am specifically referring to waste that meet the regulatory definition of a hazardous waste under Colorado's equivalent to RCRA. Now this is important because sometimes facilities in Colorado will look up regulations in the federal RCRA regulations and not in the Colorado hazardous waste regulations. And in some cases, we in Colorado are more stringent than the federal RCRA program. And then what happens is people get confused and they get frustrated, and that begins to set in. They call me up and they say, hey, what's going on? I'm looking for these regs. I'm looking under RCRA, but you told me something different. All right, so this is a bit of a nuance, but it's important to understand which regulations apply to facilities in Colorado, and that's Colorado's solid and hazardous waste regulations, not the federal RCRA program. All right, so to add yet another nuance to this, bear in mind that when you read a product label or SDS regarding disposal, and it states check with your local, state, tribal, federal regulations on proper disposal, in Colorado, the proper disposal regulations are in fact our solid waste regulations and our Colorado hazardous waste regulations, not the federal set, the RCRA set of regulations.
So when I hear the word hazardous, does that mean anything hazardous is regulated by the Colorado hazardous waste regulations?
No, and that's a really good question. You'll have the word hazardous in a lot of different waste streams. Like for instance, biohazardous waste has the word hazardous right in the title of the waste. But that doesn't mean that it that meets the definition of a hazardous waste in the regulations. And that's what's really important to know about that question. It's not just whether it's called a hazardous waste or inherently dangerous, like a sharp or a biohazardous material, or a pharmaceutical that's improperly used. They can all be dangerous and hazardous to one's health, but that doesn't mean that it meets the definition of a hazardous waste. And it has to meet the definition of a hazardous waste in order to be regulated as a hazardous waste in our regulations in the state of Colorado.
Great. So today we're going to help healthcare facilities in Colorado better understand the management and disposal requirements for waste regulated by the Colorado hazardous waste regulations. Who do these regulations apply to?
Any business that generates a hazardous waste that meets the definition in Colorado hazardous waste regulations is subject to proper disposal of hazardous waste. Any business. And so in the healthcare industry, that's going to be your hospitals, your long-term care, ambulatory services, pharmacies. It could be doctors and vets if they're generating this kind of waste, for instance. It could also be assisted living facilities. In assisted living facilities, it gets a little bit grayer, a little bit more complicated, and we're going to touch on that a little bit here today in this video. And we also have some supporting documentation on our website discussing assisted living facilities as well, so folks in that industry might want to check out that letter as well. But nevertheless, any business that generates a Colorado hazardous waste as defined in our regulations is subject to these disposal regulations.
What types of waste at facilities might be a Colorado-defined hazardous waste?
Well, typical healthcare waste that could be a Colorado hazardous waste would include undispensed medications, physician RX samples, pre-filled syringes, certain empty packages, and other type material. This list that you're looking at gets captured by the hazardous waste regulations typically due to a pharmaceutical component of the material. However, as we're going to discuss later, other wastes in healthcare can also meet the definition of a Colorado-defined hazardous waste, including liquids, creams, and disinfectants, to name a few.
Okay, so I can see that it gets complex. What were healthcare facilities doing with this waste historically? Was it getting thrown in the trash?
Yes, historically and unfortunately still persisting today, pharmaceutical waste was sent down the drain or into the regular trash. When sharps became regulated in the early 1990s, pharmaceuticals were commonly disposed of into the sharps bin as well. Bear in mind that Colorado hazardous waste regulations have been around for over 30 years, and they've always applied to healthcare. However, it hasn't been recognized until relatively recently that pharmaceutical waste has been accumulating in our drinking water, albeit in very small quantities across the U.S., including for us here in Colorado. As a result of this recognition, Colorado has begun to address the issue by enforcing existing regulations to curb disposal of pharmaceuticals down the drain or into landfills not designed to handle that type of waste. This includes hazardous waste as well as non-hazardous pharmaceutical waste.
What are some healthcare wastes you typically see being confused for hazardous waste that are not?
Well, it's really common with the two big waste streams in the healthcare industry. You're looking at sharps, you're looking at biohazardous. And when you think about something that's hazardous, it's not a stretch to look at the sharp and go, well, that's hazardous. It's inherently hazardous just by the nature of what it is being a sharp. Or biohazardous waste, it's right in the title of the waste. And so it's easy to look at that and go, well, that must be what they're talking about. That must be what Dan's talking about. He's talking about hazardous waste. Well, here it is, biohazardous waste. And it's important to understand that, in fact, if there's no pharmaceutical component to either one of those waste streams, typically they're not going to meet the definition of a hazardous waste as defined in our Colorado hazardous waste regulations. And that's the really important part. There's a lot of material out there that are inherently dangerous or inherently hazardous. But if they don't meet the definition of a hazardous waste in the regulations, they're not going to be regulated as a hazardous waste in Colorado. So that's the really important thing to know. Just because it says hazardous doesn't mean that it necessarily is a hazardous waste regulated as a hazardous waste in Colorado.
What can healthcare facilities do with pharmaceutical waste that does not meet the definition of a Colorado hazardous waste?
In Colorado, down the drain or into the regular trash is not a regulatory option. However, you do have 5 options which are listed in the Colorado solid waste regulations for the proper disposal of a pharmaceutical waste that does not meet Colorado's definition of a hazardous waste. And number 1, you can send it to a reverse distributor. 2, send it to a mail-back service. 3, you can treat it to encapsulate or stabilize the waste at an approved medical waste treatment facility prior to disposal in a regular landfill. 4, you can incinerate it at an approved solid or hazardous waste incinerator. Or 5, dispose of it at an approved solid waste disposal site. Sending this waste down the drain or into the regular landfill untreated is not a regulatory option. That would be considered illegal disposal. So when a facility identifies pharmaceutical waste as non-hazardous, they have the option to manage it as a non-hazardous waste using one of these 5 options we just discussed. Or they could upgrade it and just manage it as a Colorado hazardous waste. And typically, like in a long-term care facility, this is where I commonly find this scenario playing out, because they don't generate a lot of waste. It's a small volume. And so to spend a lot of time managing it, separating out, would cost more than if they just shipped off their pharmaceutical waste as a Colorado hazardous waste. And so depending on how much you generate, what kind of waste you do have some options about how you can go about separating it or managing it all together. It's called sorting or not sorting, and then deciding on how you're going to do proper disposal on that waste.
I know we'll get into the details of Colorado-defined hazardous waste later, but in general, what should these facilities be doing with waste that meets that definition?
Okay, well, let's be real specific right up front here. The first thing that they shouldn't be doing is sending that waste, whether it's a haz waste or it's a non-haz pharmaceutical waste. In either case, that material can't be going down the drain or into the regular trash without approval or a permit. And typically, that's just not going to be the case. There are exceptions. There's always exceptions. But typically, that material can't be sent down the drain or into the regular trash. That's illegal disposal. So what should they be doing? The very first thing, and we're talking about this a lot today in the video, is they have to identify what type of waste that they have. So identification is key. Once you know what type of waste you have, then you can start to look at, well, which regulations apply. And that's also what we're going to be talking about a lot today. So identification. And then the second part, and this is very specific to Colorado's hazardous waste regulations, once you identify your Colorado-defined hazardous waste, you have to ensure proper disposal on that waste. And those are the 2 big takeaways of this entire video, of this whole conversation. Identifying the type of waste you have, and then ensuring proper disposal on it.
Now that we have that background, let's get into the problematic areas right away. What about products that allow you to mix the pharmaceuticals with other substances? Are those then safe to dispose of in the trash?
The short answer is no, not in Colorado. There's a lot of products out there that claim that if you do a certain process, mix water with the waste and put it in a container and shake it up and put this other material in it, that once you do that you can then dispose of that into the regular trash. That is not consistent with Colorado state law, not solid waste regulations and not Colorado's hazardous waste regulations. So it's important to understand that while the marketing and the product label will say, yes, you can do that, and then it's safe for disposal in the regular trash, they're not taking into consideration state law. Colorado state law does not allow. We just went through the 5 options for non-hazardous pharmaceuticals, for instance. And you'll notice nowhere in it does it say you can mix it with these products and go ahead and throw it in the regular trash. So bear in mind that whether it's non-haz or hazardous, the answer to that question is no. If you're using it for diversion or for some other reason at your facility for security of the medication waste and on some level, then please, by all means, you can use it. It's not illegal to use those products. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't change its final direction of disposal. So you can use those products, but if it's a hazardous waste going in, a defined hazardous waste going in to the mixing scenario and the shaking up scenario, on disposal, it's still a hazardous waste. You have the extra weight that you have to now dispose of. And again, if you're using it for some other purpose, wonderful. However, it does not change the direction of final disposal in Colorado.
What about facilities that may store pharmaceuticals or other products for future use? Do the Colorado hazardous waste regulations apply to those products while they're in storage?
No. These regulations do not apply to products. They only apply to waste. And so at some point, the products that you have become unusable. Whether it was destroyed, dropped, expiration dates, something happened that you can no longer use for its intended purpose, and now you have to do disposal. At that moment, that's when you need to be thinking about Colorado's solid and Colorado's hazardous waste regulations.
What about in a surgical setting where there's usually only one container for the waste?
You know, that question comes up a lot, and I want to make sure I make this very, very clear right up front. In a surgical setting or any healthcare scenario where a nurse, a healthcare professional is taking care of a patient, that is the primary activity. That's what's important, not these disposal regulations, not at that moment. But in a surgical setting, at some point the surgery ends, and at that point you start to do the cleanup of the room and you start to handle the waste. And at that point you need to be taking a look at what kind of waste you have and making sure that you're applying the appropriate regulations to whatever is in that container or containers. And so in a surgical setting, they could be using a single container, for instance. And in that single container, there could be no pharmaceuticals, empty sharps, biohazardous waste that doesn't have pharmaceutical waste as a part of it. And in that setting, that would be one type of waste. It might just be a sharps and biohazardous waste. However, it's same exact scenario, but now you have some pharmaceuticals that were still in syringes. You have pharmaceuticals that found its way into the single disposal container in a surgical setting. You have to consider that as well. And that's a part that hadn't been considered too much in the past. But we're looking at that now saying, if you have that type of container and you're mixing that kind of waste, and some of that waste is a defined Colorado hazardous waste, you need to look at the proper disposal of that container based on what's in there. And it's really important to evaluate that. If you can do it before the surgery, great. If you do it after the surgery, again, great. But at some point, what's in the container, communicate that to your disposal contractor, and make sure that you're following Colorado hazardous waste regulations on proper disposal requirements.
Let's conclude this section with some common questions we get here at the state. When are inspections done? How often? And are financial penalties a possibility?
Inspections are typically done either in response to a complaint or simply part of our regulatory inspection process. As far as violations and penalties, yes, both are possible and have happened within the healthcare industry as it relates to hazardous waste management and disposal. With regards to financial penalties, they can vary greatly depending on the violation. But the typical areas where facilities are out of compliance include failure to make a hazardous waste determination, which can have a penalty of $2,000 or more per waste stream, and illegal disposal of hazardous waste, which can carry a penalty of up to $15,000 per day. So I mentioned earlier that we have a self-certification program for the management of hazardous waste generated by businesses in Colorado. This program is done annually by each facility in the program and is essentially an inspection they perform on themselves while documenting their results using an online form. Once done, that form is sent to us electronically. Now bear in mind, we use the data to evaluate compliance across particular sectors, including healthcare. We do not use the program to target specific facilities for inspections, but rather to understand overall compliance issues throughout particular sectors. So if you're notified to complete a hazardous waste self-certification at your facility, you are required by law to complete it within a time frame specified. Now we've found that compliance rates increase significantly for those facilities that are included in this program because the process walks each facility through a hazardous waste inspection, which provides the information they need to know to achieve and maintain regulatory compliance. As a result, compliance rates improve dramatically. We've also developed a training video for those involved in our self-certification program to better understand how to go about completing the form. So if you're required to complete a certification, be sure to review the video first. Each year, we perform follow-up inspections on random facilities in each self-certification sector to verify the information from the certification is up to date and accurate.
Let's review. According to the Colorado Solid Waste Regulations, can a non-hazardous pharmaceutical waste be disposed down the drain or into the regular trash? The answer is no. What about a Colorado-defined hazardous waste? Can that be disposed down the drain? No. In summary, first decide if the pharmaceutical is a waste or if it is still a product. Remember, all waste starts off as solid waste, and healthcare facilities manage multiple types of waste streams. Different regulatory requirements can exist for each stream, and mixing waste streams needs to be evaluated for proper disposal. Medical waste is typically the largest waste stream in the healthcare setting and doesn't usually meet our definitions of a hazardous waste. But again, be aware of mixing waste streams. And finally, households are exempt from some regulations, including Colorado's hazardous waste regulations. So once medications are sent home, they are no longer the responsibility of the facility. Thanks for that background and framework for how these regulations can apply to healthcare facilities. Say a facility doesn't know if it generates a kind of waste that meets the Colorado hazardous waste definitions. What do they do?
It's important to understand that in Colorado hazardous waste regulations, it's incumbent upon the generator, the facility that makes the waste, to make what you call a hazardous waste determination. So that responsibility lies with the facility, it lies with the generator of the waste. But how do you go about doing that in a healthcare setting? Well, you can ask your pharmacist for help. You can call your disposal contractor and work with them. There'll be a fee associated with that, but that's part of the process. You can do the same thing with a consultant. And if you take a look at my frequently asked questions online, the document I referenced before, I go into a nice detailed explanation of all the different ways that a facility can utilize, whether it be hiring somebody or doing it on their own. So that would be a great place to go and get into those details a little bit more.
You've mentioned this term generator several times. What exactly is a generator?
Generator is any business that generates hazardous waste. It's just a term in the regulation to identify the business that's making the waste. And it could be three categories. The lowest category, VSQG, very small quantity generator. The next category up is small quantity generator, SQG. And the largest category is LQG, large quantity generator. The category you fit into depends on how much you generate per month and how much you have stored on site at any one time. The vast majority of healthcare facilities in Colorado are VSQGs, formerly known as Conditionally Exempt Small Quantity Generators, or CESQGs. A recent regulatory update made a change to the name of the lowest category, so CESQGs are now known as VSQGs in our regulations. If your facility is a small quantity generator, or SQG, or a large quantity generator referred to as an LQG, this video training does not include the additional SQG, LQG requirements. So VSQGs generate less than 220 pounds per month of defined hazardous waste and less than 2.2 pounds per month or on-site at any one time of a specific list of acute hazardous waste referred to as P-listed hazardous waste. With the exception of approximately 35 hospitals in Colorado, the remaining healthcare facilities fall into the VSQG category. There are two ways that a waste can be a Colorado hazardous waste. It could be a listed waste, meaning it's already on a list, or it could be a characteristic waste, which means the waste will meet a definition of ignitable, corrosive, reactive, and/or toxic as detailed in Colorado hazardous waste regulations. Let's start with listed waste. An internet search can easily pull up the P and U list. What's important to know up front about the P and U list is that they are for waste that haven't been used. If the product was used, it will not be a P or U listed waste when needing to dispose of it. But it still may be a characteristic waste, and we will get into the details of characteristic hazardous waste later on in the video. Common examples of P-listed waste include phentermine, warfarin at concentrations greater than 0.3% for P-listed waste, and nicotine waste. Let's discuss nicotine more in depth, as it illustrates my point about P and U list only applying to unused products requiring disposal. If you were to look up nicotine on the P or U list, you would find that it's actually a P-listed waste. Code is P075. So if you have a nicotine patch that expires, then it's an unused product requiring disposal. In this case, that unused nicotine patch would be considered a P075 listed waste for disposal purposes. When a nicotine patch is used on a patient, it's no longer a P-listed waste because the P and U list is for unused, not used, but for unused commercial chemical products. Might the nicotine patch still be a characteristic hazardous waste? Well, sure, it might be, but if the patch was used, the P or U listing will not apply. In the case of a nicotine patch, they typically are not a characteristic hazardous waste, so used nicotine patches can be disposed of as a non-hazardous pharmaceutical waste. So whether the material was used for its intended purpose or not is key when looking at P or U listed waste. A second consideration for P-listed waste is tracking how much P-listed waste you generate on a monthly basis or have on site in your hazardous waste storage bin at any one time. As I mentioned earlier, most healthcare facilities fall into the VSQG or very small quantity generator category within our hazardous waste regulations. However, if a facility generates more than 2.2 pounds of P-listed waste within a given month or stores more than 2.2 pounds of P-listed waste on site at any one time, that facility moves from the VSQG category to the large quantity generator or LQG category. That means the facility is now subject to all of the LQG requirements, which are significantly more complicated than just meeting VSQG requirements. So tracking the weight of your P-listed waste medication on a monthly basis is important for this very reason. A third consideration for P-listed waste items includes that portion of the packaging or containers that held P-listed waste, because that material is also considered a hazardous waste and needs to be disposed of as a P-listed waste as well. Please bear in mind that you do not count the weight of those containers towards your 2.2 pound threshold. Let me repeat that. You do not count the weight of the P-listed containers towards your 2.2 pound threshold. In addition, healthcare facilities have been calculating the residual amount of waste still inside the container in order to add that amount to their P-listed waste totals. However, based on our experience in Colorado, these residual amounts have not been observed to be significant enough to change a facility's generator status. But remember to capture the P-listed packaging that came in contact with the medication and dispose of it as a P-listed waste. So how about U-listed waste? Well, U-listed waste is also for unused commercial chemical products, so if it's been used, the U listing will not apply. Also, please know that the container and/or packaging requirement is only for P-listed waste, not U-listed waste items. Some medications that are captured under the U list include chemotherapy drugs, and many questions have risen due to different modes of administering that type of drug. An example here would be a chemo drug that's listed as a U-listed waste injected into a person who then passes that drug through their urine. Is that chemo drug in urine now a U-listed waste? And the answer is no, because the drug was used for its intended purpose, it was injected into the body, then expelled through urinating. If that same drug became expired or unused, then yes, it would be a U-listed hazardous waste upon disposal, assuming it was listed on the U list. Remember, only the P list is subject to the 2.2 pound monthly or total on-site threshold. The 220 pound threshold refers to all Colorado-defined hazardous waste generated at your facility. Here are some examples of typical U-listed waste found in healthcare facilities. Notice that warfarin shows up as a P-listed and a U-listed waste. Well, why is that? Well, the P-listed version is greater than 0.3% and the U-listed is less than 0.3%. So warfarin is a listed waste regardless of concentration. In addition, please note that there are exceptions to several chemicals on the P and U listings, including epinephrine and nitroglycerin. In both cases, the medicinal versions of these chemicals do not meet the P or U listing definitions and therefore are not considered P or U listed waste. They might meet a characteristic definition, but they will not be considered a P or U listed waste when disposed. There are other listings that may apply to healthcare, specifically F-listed waste, which includes solvents typically used in a laboratory setting. If you're dealing with this type of waste stream in your facility and have questions, contact the division for further guidance. So let's review. P and U waste lists are for unused materials. If used, these listings won't apply, but a facility must still determine if that waste meets the definition of a characteristic hazardous waste. Just because it is or isn't a P-listed waste doesn't mean it's not also a characteristic hazardous waste as well. P-listed waste has requirements for the disposal of the packaging that the P-listed waste was stored in. And there's no need to calculate residual amount of P-listed waste contained within the packaging or containers in Colorado. Just ensure that the P-listed packing is sent for hazardous waste disposal. P-listed waste has a 2.2 pound threshold, which, if exceeded, bumps the facility up to large quantity generator status. So be aware. This is why tracking of hazardous waste generation per month is necessary. 2 tracking logs are suggested, one for P-listed waste and another for all of the rest of your Colorado-defined hazardous waste materials. And you're looking for monthly weights here. That is, how much are you generating every month?
In the last section, we explained that listed waste is based on chemicals already identified as hazardous and included on lists like the P, U, and F listings. In this section, we're going to discuss characteristic hazardous waste, which is based on chemistry and physical properties. Characteristic hazardous waste includes 4 categories: ignitable, corrosive, reactive, and toxic. Let's look at each one and see how it can apply to the healthcare setting.
Ignitability has a 3-part definition that needs to be met in order for that material to be an ignitable waste, including being greater than 50% water, containing 24% alcohol or more by volume, and having a flash point of less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Examples include rubbing alcohol, some topical preparations, and many liquid pharmaceuticals. Be sure to look at the product description and accompanying SDS sheet, which typically will include this information to make a proper hazardous waste determination. Corrosivity is defined as a liquid, not a solid, but a liquid with a pH of less than or equal to 2 or greater than or equal to 12.5. Examples include glacial acetic acid and sodium hydroxide. The reactivity characteristic doesn't typically apply to healthcare since it's not every day that a healthcare facility deals with explosive and water-reactive wastes. The toxic list includes chemicals from D004 through D043 with a regulatory concentration level for each constituent above which the mixture is considered a hazardous waste. This list shows only a few examples of compounds. The entire list of toxic characteristic hazardous waste constituents can be found in the Colorado Hazardous Waste Regulations located on our website. The way this list works is a facility identifies what's in the material through the product insert and/or SDS sheet, which is called the safety data sheet, then determines the leachable concentration of each regulated constituent, and finally compares that concentration to the regulatory thresholds included on the list. If any constituent exceeds the regulatory threshold, then you have a toxic hazardous waste for the chemical or chemicals. Well, how do you determine leachable concentrations? First, know that industry knowledge is an acceptable method for making a hazardous waste determination. But if this information isn't readily available through industry knowledge, then the leachable concentrations are determined by having the material tested at a laboratory using what's called the TCLIP test, which stands for Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure. For liquid waste, it's typically a 1-to-1 relationship between the milligrams per liter concentration reported on the SDS or insert for a particular chemical. However, whether it's liquid or non-liquid materials, it's not the concentration of the chemicals of concern that matters, it's the leachable concentration that matters. And that's what the TCLIP test results will indicate. Here are some examples of toxic hazardous waste for mercury and cresol. Mercury can be found in some healthcare products such as eye drops, nasal sprays, and some vaccines. If mercury is present above 0.2 milligrams per liter, then it meets the definition of a hazardous waste and must be managed according to the Colorado Hazardous Waste Regulations. The same process and determination is made with insulins which contain cresol. If the cresol level is above 200 milligrams per liter, then it meets the definition of a hazardous waste and must be managed according to the Colorado Hazardous Waste Regulations. Unlike P-listed waste, where the container must be captured and disposed as a hazardous waste, all other hazardous waste containers can be emptied and handled as whatever type of container it is without hazardous waste regulatory considerations. For example, if you extract insulin from a vial into a syringe and have insulin left over after the injection, you can squirt the insulin into a small paper towel, put that towel into a small baggie, and place that waste into the hazardous waste container. The resulting empty syringe or vial is now what's called RECRA empty and can be disposed as a sharp, a glass, or regular trash as appropriate. Please see our FAQs for more details. So, now that we've talked about what waste can be a hazardous waste and how to identify that waste, let's review what the next steps are for handling and disposing of this waste. Once you've identified your hazardous waste, you'll need to select a container for storage of your waste on site. Here are some examples of what typically is used in a healthcare facility to store your hazardous waste. At the VSQG level, there are no specific container management requirements, but here are best management practices that should be followed. First, make sure the container is in good condition, kept closed except when adding or removing waste, and labeled as a hazardous waste.
Now that you've identified your hazardous waste and selected containers to hold that waste on site, the next step is to track how much hazardous waste is generated at your facility every month. So you'll need to either develop a method of weighing your hazardous waste at your facility each month, or discuss with your disposal contractor the possibility of obtaining that information from them on a regular basis. Either way, the requirement is to know what your generator category is, and that's done by tracking how much hazardous waste you generate on a monthly basis. Be sure to store and track your P-listed waste separately from all other Colorado hazardous waste so you know whether you're generating over 2.2 pounds per month or storing more than 2.2 pounds on site at any one time. Here's an example of a tracking log for P-listed hazardous waste, as well as a tracking log for non-P-listed hazardous waste. Please notice that the information gathered is not complex or overly detailed. Simply make a note of what's going into the container as a waste and collect the weight of that waste on a monthly basis. This is your weight tracking log.
Okay, so weight is the key and keeping the P-listed waste separate. What's next?
The very next step is to ensure proper disposal, and that means hiring a contractor to handle the transportation and disposal of your waste. But be sure to discuss the type of waste you need to have transported, and don't assume that they will know what you have in your waste containers. If you don't tell them, they won't know, and it's up to each facility to ensure proper disposal on their hazardous waste. So be sure to fully disclose what's in the container. In addition, be sure to discuss container needs with your disposal contractor. Depending on the type of waste, they may have specific containers they'll need you to use for them to pick up your waste and remain in compliance with transportation regulations that they are responsible for on their end.
How should facilities go about ensuring proper disposal?
So the question on ensuring proper disposal comes up quite a bit. Be sure to communicate with your disposal contractor and get everything in writing. Ask your disposal company for documentation that they can accept your waste. The verification should include the name, address, EPA ID number, and type of record permit held by the facility. Be sure your contract with your disposal company includes language regarding Colorado regulated hazardous waste, and not just biohazardous waste, but specifically Colorado-defined hazardous waste. The biggest mistake I encounter here is that people think their waste is properly disposed, but during an inspection and after review of the contract between a facility and a disposal contractor, we find that the hazardous waste is not identified in the contract. If it's not spelled out in the contract, there's a good chance it's simply being managed as a sharp or biohazardous waste, and that constitutes illegal disposal in Colorado.
Great, so the main takeaway there seems to be to check your contract, get everything in writing.
Definitely.
What about hazardous waste manifests? Should healthcare facilities be using those?
A hazardous waste manifest is not required for the very small quantity generator category. It's just not required. It is required for small quantity generators and LQGs, but it's not for VSQGs. However, we highly recommend that you do use one because, as you can see here, all the information you need to know about your waste is included in this document, including your facility information, the transporter information, the name and address of the final destination facility, a description of your waste, and the signatures and dates of everyone who's handled your waste, including the final destination facility, included here on the last line in the form. This form is used with each shipment of hazardous waste from your facility, and as you can see, it tells you everything you need to know to keep track of your waste stream and document who handled it and where it went. This document goes a long way to ensuring proper disposal of your hazardous waste.
Are there other requirements for VSQGs?
Yes, facilities are required to make sure that they minimize the potential for release to people and environment. And the way this plays out in healthcare is shredding of pharmaceutical waste. If you shred pharmaceutical waste and you don't capture the dust before it liberates, gets into the air, you could be breathing it, you could be getting it on your clothes, on your shoes, and now you're walking around the facility. And that bumps right up against failure to minimize the potential for release to people and environment of your waste. So you have to be careful of what's happening in your waste, make sure the containers are in good shape, and if you are shredding, make sure you contain the dust.
Great, that's cleared up a lot of questions I had personally, and I hope it helps our facilities as well. One more question, what about controlled substances? Is there anything special our facilities should be doing with those?
First, it's really important to know that controlled substances are controlled by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, and not by Colorado hazardous waste regulations. As a product, the way they use it, that's all DEA. And so when it comes to disposal, you have to meet DEA diversion requirements first because of what it is, it being a controlled substance. Now, what's also important to know is the majority of controlled substances are not a Colorado hazardous waste when disposal is needed. It would be actually a non-hazardous pharmaceutical waste. And that would fall to our solid waste regulations like we've talked here today. But what's important to know is first you meet DEA requirements. Once you meet their diversion requirements, then our disposal regulations kick in, whether it's a hazardous waste following Colorado hazardous waste regulations, or if it's a solid waste following Colorado solid waste regulations. First, handle the DEA controlled substance per DEA requirements for diversion, and then you can do proper disposal on that waste.
If you had to leave facilities with a short list of decisions they need to make today regarding their waste, what would those be?
Well, the facilities should first ask themselves, how will we make our hazardous waste determinations? Second, will we sort hazardous from non-hazardous waste or send it all off as hazardous waste? Next, how will we keep track of the amount of hazardous waste we are generating? Then, who will we use to properly dispose of our pharmaceutical waste? And lastly, how will we ensure proper disposal on that waste? Be sure to check out our guidance documents and compliance aids on our website.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today, Dan.
You're welcome.
If you have other questions or need additional help, call the CDPHE Technical Assistance Line at 303-692-3320. We also have a webpage dedicated to medical and pharmaceutical waste that includes FAQs. It can be found at www.colorado.gov/CDPHE/medical waste.